born with a curiosity about the world.
Why can't I breathe underwater?
Where do the stars go in the daytime?
Why is the sky blue?
How come dogs can't talk?
In our youth, it seems there's no end to the questions.
Why is the desert so hot?
But even as we get older, we've still got questions.
Does hypnosis really work?
Do babies dream?
Why is it so hard to quit smoking?
Psychology researchers all over the world are busy asking and answering questions about behavior. They're unlocking the mysteries of the brain, discovering how and why we think the way we do, and at times overturning our assumptions about human behavior.
Our culture is strikingly resistant to giving up cherished ideas, whether they're true or not. We get a sense of truth in the culture. And when science runs counter to that, there are pitched battles.
So psychology is really on the frontier of changing some of the basic principles.
We are often so attached to our notions of common sense, we wonder why researchers bother to investigate things that seem so obvious.
Hey, excuse me. Can I take a moment of your time? Just want to ask you a quick question. All right. A recent study shows that 28% of our waking life is spent talking, while 4% is spent on a computer. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, a lot of life seems like it's just dealing with people, so it sounds pretty obvious.
There's a phenomenon called the hindsight bias. It's also known as the I knew it all along phenomenon. And it's the tendency, once you know the outcome, to think, my grandmother could have told you that. When in fact it wasn't so obvious to the researchers beforehand, or they wouldn't have done the study.
A recent study shows that 28% of our waking life is spent on a computer, while only 4% is spent talking to people. Does that surprise you?
It's not exactly a shocker. People spend probably much more time in front of a computer.
Anything, or its opposite, has a way of seeming like obvious common sense once you know what the result is.
Psychologist and Nobel recipient Daniel Kahneman, while serving in the Israeli army, was given a test to challenge his common sense observation.
There was a technique for selecting officer candidates. It had been introduced by the British, I think, in World War II, and it involved leaderless group activities. So you would bring a group of 8 people, give them a telephone pole, there'd be a wall, and you'd instruct them to get to the other side of the wall without the pole touching the wall or ever touching the ground, and without anybody touching the wall. It can be done. It's very difficult. It was really very striking how easy it seemed to be to detect the personalities of these people. And we were truly confident that we could see their leadership abilities. And, it seemed to be inescapable. But once every couple of months or so, we would get information about how well we were doing in just predicting the performance of these individuals as cadets in officer training, and the truth is we couldn't do it at all. I mean, our predictions were essentially worthless.
There is a phenomenon we call the overconfidence phenomenon, which is the tendency of people to be more confident about their judgments than they are correct. And thus the purpose of psychological science is to try to discern what actually is.
You can't just use your intuitions. You have to make measurements that other people will agree measure what you think you're measuring. And that measure the same thing reliably.
For a psychologist, deciding what to measure often begins as a matter of personal interest.
You've got an idea, either that came from intuition or came from other studies that you did. You think this is a darn good idea, and you want to prove it. So now you create very specific material.
One puzzle that fascinates psychologists is the relationship between a person's emotional well-being and their overall health. To explore this question, we may have a hunch about, say, the specific connection between happiness and health.
There's nothing wrong with having a hunch and then thinking about it hard and reading what other people have said and coming up with a precise hypothesis, but then you have to operationalize it.
To define such abstract concepts as happiness and health, researchers must create operational definitions. That is, they must specify how these variables will be measured in a given study. These definitions assure the hypothesis will be testable. To define health, for example, we might measure our subjects' reported frequency of illness, or perhaps evaluate their immune system based on a thorough physical exam. To measure happiness, we might start by asking people how happy they are.
This can be done with some very simple questions like, taking all things together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say you're very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? Also, we have behavioral measures of people's smiling, and their postures and so forth that give evidence of their happiness.
The smile, in its purest form, just involves a couple of muscles. The zygomatic major pulls the lip corners up, okay? And then there's a muscle that surrounds the eye called the orbicularis oculi, which gives you crow's feet, tightens the lower eyelid, and then raises your cheek up a little. And you code the activity of two muscles and add that together.
We can do biological things like frontal EEG, monitoring whether there's more activity in the left or right frontal brain. So we can do all kinds of things to measure happiness.
Psychologists have multiple research methods at their disposal, each with their own strengths and limitations. To begin a study on happiness, researchers might start with an in-depth case study, which looks intensely at just one or a few selected individuals.
I would call my best friend and say, I feel like I'm on the elevator to hell. And I would just go down. And I would not talk, not want to watch TV, not want to do anything.
For our purposes, a case study of someone who is unhappy may suggest conditions that contribute to happiness.
And a case study looks at particular people in depth, and sometimes that can be very suggestive of a phenomenon that we'd like to study on a larger scale. Jean Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist, studied a very few children in great depth and came to paint a picture of how a child's mind grows. And that was a very fertile kind of case study because it suggested some ideas that other researchers could follow up on and explore.
To move beyond the limited findings of a case study, scientists might broaden the focus of their research to a larger group of individuals using a survey.
Surveys allow us to, by randomly sampling a population, to gather a representative sample that gives us an accurate snapshot of how that whole population feels. It might be the students on a particular campus. It might be the citizens of a nation whose attitudes or well-being we'd want to study. Or we can give people little pagers and sample their waking hours a half dozen times a day, say, and calibrate their moods moment to moment.
When we do large surveys, a lot of times they're very quick, and you're asking people, are you satisfied and happy with your life? And you have thousands and thousands of subjects, and so it gives us a pretty good look, a representative look of how happy the world is.
It's important that we ask our questions carefully so we don't elicit the very responses we hope to get. We have to give the participants a chance to say what they really think, not influenced by us and our hypotheses.
Surveys are an efficient way to bring in large amounts of data that would be difficult to gather with direct observation. A survey, for example, can provide reports about people's inner thoughts and feelings. But those who use the survey method are keenly aware that data can sometimes be misleading.
When people tell you they're happy, is it correct? They may lie to you. They may lie to themselves. They may say what's socially desirable. I think it's good to be happy, so I'm going to tell you I'm happy. So this has been a very big concern in terms of doing scientific research.
You know, psychologists are funny creatures. We think that a paper and pencil survey can provide answers about people. And I think the kind of answer that a paper and pencil survey provides is very gross and decontextualized.
Suppose Darwin didn't go on the Beagle voyage. he called all the people who knew about animals to England and said, tell me about animals, I don't think he would have come up with evolution.
In the 60s and 70s, there was great emphasis in what was called naturalistic observation. And you would just stand in a corner and make counts and observe things.
Naturalistic observations catches people in their real environments and observes them without manipulating them in any artificial way. For example, there's a recent study at the University of Texas that took snippets recorded on the person's belt out of every 12 minutes of 52 students' waking hours. And so they could ask some interesting questions like, what percent of the time were people talking? That turned out to be 28%. What percent of the time were they on a computer? That turned out to be 4%.
Though naturalistic observation allows us to objectively measure behavior, it tells us nothing about the subject's thoughts, attitudes, or past experience. For this reason, naturalistic observation is often combined with a survey, each method helping to overcome the deficiencies of the other. To determine the interrelationship between two events or sets of data, researchers often measure two different variables within each individual involved in a study. These correlational studies are done to see if there is any link or association between those two variables.
So correlational studies look at the naturally occurring associations between different things. If we find a correlation, we can use either one of those factors to predict the other.
For example, we might examine our participants' responses from our happiness survey, then check to see if their happiness answers relate systematically to their health measures.
All of a sudden we start to say, gee, maybe people saying they're happy isn't just some response that they make up, because it correlates with things. It correlates, for example, with their immune function. How strong is their immune system working? It correlates with some hormone measures. It correlates with some cardiac measures. And that could be one reason why happy people have a little bit better health, because it affects things like immune parameters.
Depending on the variables involved, the correlation could be positive or negative. Or we might check happiness against some variables and see a zero correlation.
Knowing somebody's age doesn't tell me much about their happiness. Knowing somebody's gender tells me very little about their happiness. Knowing somebody's income gives me only a little bit of a clue.
To expand our research into happiness and health, we might approach our topic from a slightly different angle and see that depression correlates with a depressed immune system. But does depression cause the decreased immune system?
Making causal statements is really a tricky business in a correlational study. Any relationship we find between, say, depression and the immune system is a two-way street. It could be that depression is causing changes in the immune system. But we now know that the immune system can actually affect the brain and alter moods and cognitions and affective states.
It could be that one is causing the other, or it could be that both are independently the result of some underlying third factor.
This is what we call the third variable problem.
In this study, the third variable could be any number of things, from the subject's level of income, level of alcohol use, access to medical care, or their amount of exercise.
Could it be that the relationship between depression and the immune system is because depressed people don't eat as well or engage in negative behaviors that actually affect their immune systems?
So it takes an experiment to sort out cause and effect, and that's why, where it's feasible, psychological scientists love to do experiments in which they randomly assign people to an experimental condition that gets a particular treatment.
All research methods involve careful observation and measurement. But in an experiment, the name of the game is control.
Now, usually in careful experiments, we try to manipulate a single variable. We want one thing to differ between the control group and the experimental group, and everything else to be the same.
In an experimental study, you manipulate the independent variable. So you can randomly assign people to either get an antidepressant medication or not, for example. And then you find changes.
In the case of a clinical trial where the experimental group gets an antidepressant, the control group would be issued a placebo.
Whenever you're testing the effects of a new drug, you have to compare it against a placebo, and the placebo has to look and taste and feel exactly like the real drug. Placebos are really essential mechanisms for determining that the drug or surgical procedure or psychological treatment is having a specific effect on the outcome, and is not just a function of the patient getting better as a function of natural history.
Could we demonstrate scientifically that a person's unhappiness or perhaps their level of stress has a negative effect on their immune system? To find out, we could conduct an experiment similar to that done by Carnegie Mellon researcher Sheldon Cohen.
We did a study where we randomly assigned primates to stressed and non-stressed conditions. We wanted to manipulate chronic stress so that we knew that there was a cause-effect relationship. In our case, they're all male animals, and we randomly assigned them to be in a group that's stable over the course of the 2-year period. So there are 5 animals in the cage total, but it's always the same 5 animals. And the other group are rotated on a monthly basis. So you take 5 animals, you put them in a cage, then you put them in another cage with at least 3 new animals in an unstable social situation that's stressful to them.
Level of stress, manipulated by the researcher, served as the independent variable in this experiment. The dependent variable, a measure of the animal's health status, was the factor measured to see if the independent variable actually had the anticipated effect. Because the only thing initially different between the two groups is their stress level, we can be confident that any change in the primate's immune systems or other health factors is likely a result of the unstable situation in which they were placed. Of course, doing an experiment such as this on human subjects would be impractical, as well as unethical.
With human beings, we are grossly restricted in the kind of studies that can be done. With animals, we can do experiments which will allow us to say very specifically that this is the cause of. It's absolutely required.
Everybody's different, but you can breed mice to be identical. We have strains of mice where every single mouse is genetically the same as every other single mouse. So we can have virtually clones of mice.
In animal laboratory experiments, we can control all of the relevant conditions. So the animals can be of the right age. They can be in perfect health. We can maintain them with perfect diet. We can maintain them with perfect light-dark regimes in their lives. So when they are subject to the experiments that we do, we can rule out the possibility that it was the time of the day, it was the time of the year, it was the humidity, it was a disease or something of the other. We have that all controlled in our experiments.
Now, needless to say, mice are not people. Mice are not people in terms of their cardiovascular system, and mice are not people, certainly in terms of their brains, their minds, their feelings, etc. But there are some aspects of mice that are really very, very similar to people.
We are not like animals, we are animals. Just like all cars share certain things in common. They have steering wheels and motors and brakes and ignition systems and so forth, whether they're Mercedes or Chevys. So all mammalian species share certain principles, including certain principles regarding the organization of their brains.
You have a very large number of receptor neurons in the nose, or the equivalent of the nose for other animals, such as the antennae for insects, that converge to specialized structures with glomeruli within it. That's called the olfactory bulb in us, it's called the antennal lobe in insects. And that basic structure seems to be the same, or very similar across species. So that's again a strong rationale for using simpler systems to extrapolate to more complicated ones.
Of course, animal research can't provide answers to psychologists who have specific questions about how human beings interact. But studying human behavior in the real world is extremely challenging. Industrial organizational psychologists, for example, find it difficult to study people in the workplace.
Employers are not really happy to have a bunch of social scientists come in and study their workers. And so we do a lot of simulations. We do a lot of research with undergraduate populations where we simulate work settings to study basic processes. So it's very difficult to do some of the research that needs to be done simply because of restrictions. And you know, to study people in the workplace is both invasive in terms of shutting down the work productivity, but also invasive in terms of questions of privacy.
But researchers on the cutting edge of technology are finding new ways to test human beings. At the University of California in Santa Barbara, psychologists create virtual reality situations using what they call an immersive virtual environment.
Psychologists, particularly social psychologists, are often accused of studying things in very sterile laboratories that don't generalize to the external world. And with the immersive virtual environments, you can create a high degree of ecological realism and still have total experimental control.
Computer-generated situations such as these allow a researcher to manipulate a single variable while all other factors remain completely uniform.
So if you're studying social interaction, everybody can be at the same eye height. Everybody can have, the same size body, the same color hair, or not.
One study done in the IVE involved proxemics, the study of personal distance.
We had participants approach agents in one at a time in an immersive virtual world, and the agents either kind of just stood there like mannequins, like statues, or they behaved with a lot of what we call behavioral realism. That is, as this person approached them, they maintained eye contact, they blinked, there were some slight movements. What we determined was, in the condition in which there was this behavioral realism, people maintained personal space around the agent, even though they could walk through him. But when there was no realism, they did walk through him.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm 20.
In an immersive virtual environment. It also helps with replication, because you can send your world, your CD or DVD, to anybody else, and they can replicate your stuff exactly. So it's a very exciting kind of technology for all of psychology.
But not even technology such as this can keep human beings from knowing they're being studied.
When you study E. coli bacterium, you assume that they're probably behaving about the same way that they would behave if you weren't studying them. Human beings react to being observed. They're very, very difficult to study because of their reactivity. And that makes our methods very, very difficult.
In order to capture human reactions and decisions in their purest form, certain psychology experiments require some level of deception.
Sometimes people might be told things that aren't true because the psychologist wants to look at the effect of being unpopular, or you might tell people they're not selected for something, or, so sometimes threats are delivered to people of a mild sort in social psychology experimentation.
Most of the work that I have done, virtually all, we want to study the development of a false belief and a false memory. And so what we do is we subject our subject to some manipulation, and we might try to make them believe that they had an experience that they didn't have. The idea that we came up with is to make people believe that as children they got sick eating a particular food. And we have a nice way of getting them to believe that, and we create a bunch of people who believe they got sick eating dill pickles or believe they got sick eating hard-boiled eggs. Psychology is full of studies that involve deception, but does this one cross a line or not?
Experiments are all approved by a committee at this university, and every university, every research institute has one, and the committee consists not only of specialists in the field but also people from the community who judge the experiments that we're going to do, and they ask the questions, are these ethical and appropriate experiments to do? If they say no, we can't do the
Hi,
experiments.
Susie. Welcome back. First of all, I want to thank you for participating.
Of course, at the end of every study, there is the debriefing phase. And it's a delicate situation. We don't want our subjects to feel like saps, because they fell for this. And so we try to apologize for having to use deception and make them understand why it was necessary. And we try to make them feel their behavior is very normal and try to make them feel that, that this is an interesting experience for educating them about the workings of memory.
And I'm sorry for the deception. But with your help, we're trying to determine if memories
And I think there's an ethical sensitivity today regarding how we treat both people and animals in psychological research. So every institution is under much stricter guidelines today than was the case 20 years ago.
With so many research methods for a psychologist to choose from, one might ask, are some superior to others?
It's important to really recognize the pros and cons of each approach.
No one method is the best method. Experimentation, where we manipulate things and see how people react, can be very important, but at the same time, huge representative sample surveys can be very important. And so what we think, and we've used all these methods in our lab, is that you need all of them to truly understand human behavior.
Time and dedicated effort continue to refine the methods of what is still a young science.
I've seen a trend develop where we are using the best of the prior theories and building on them and not throwing them away wholesale. I've seen this as a very hopeful and very positive trend in our field, becoming much more a serious science that builds on its own successes.
The hope is if next generation of students, they become intolerant of our level of describing mechanisms. And they push and push and push until they come up with some new angle. And I, for one, like to urge that upon the next generation, is be dissatisfied with our level of explanation.
I'm dissatisfied with your level of explanation. I am going to find a new angle. Where's the research?
Where's the research? Are we asking the right questions? That's what good psychologists do. They ask the hard questions.
I'm the next generation. I'm the next generation. I'm the next generation.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.